She held his hand like it was just a moment, but that moment changed everything. How can one little girl bring two shattered hearts together? What happens next will leave you in tears. Before we dive in, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now where you are? Drop it in the comments. I love seeing how far this story is reaching hearts. Ethan Blake had everything money could buy: private jets, shining towers bearing his name, and a mansion perched above the city skyline. But none of it matched the quiet satisfaction he felt walking through the dim hallways of baby shelters he built, or holding the wrinkled hands of homeless elders whose beds he paid for without ever being seen. His heart beat not for applause but for impact, and the more he gave, the more human he felt. His deep blue eyes often glistened in board meetings, not with greed, but compassion, something his investors could never understand. They scoffed when he funded treatment for orphaned cancer patients or installed heating in a rundown senior center, mocking him behind closed doors, branding him too soft for this world of steel and profit. That evening, the final straw broke. A cruel smirk from his own CFO, a sarcastic comment about wasting capital on beggars, hit him like a blow, and something within him, so long resilient, fractured. The applause he once received as CEO of the Year echoed like distant thunder in his ears as he left the towering glass office and walked into the cold night alone, his breath shallow, his chest tightening with every step toward the unknown. The sky hung low with dark clouds, like it, too, was mourning something lost inside him. Ethan, dressed immaculately in a charcoal blue tailored suit with a silk tie that now felt like a noose, stumbled past strangers who barely noticed the tremor in his hands or the sheen of sweat forming on his forehead. The brightness of the city seemed too sharp, its lights like needles in his weary eyes, and the noise of honking cars and rushing feet blended into an overwhelming blur. He pulled at his collar as panic gripped his lungs, suffocating him from within like a storm crashing against glass walls. Not knowing where else to go, and too proud to call anyone from his guarded circle, he turned toward the one place he thought might still carry hope. The very hospital where he'd anonymously paid for over 300 patients' treatments. Each step inside felt heavier than the last. The hallway lights flickered above him as if reflecting the flickering within his soul. Patients lined the corridors, some crying, some moaning, some sleeping on broken benches. Yet none of them spared him a second glance, unaware that the man who had once funded entire wings now stood before them, a ghost in a suit. Nurses brushed past him, interns rushed with clipboards, a janitor whistled to himself, and a mother cradled her crying baby, but no one looked at Ethan, whose breathing had now turned to shallow gasps. His legs buckled near the emergency wing, his vision narrowing into a tunnel of chaos and color, and before he could find a seat, his knees hit the hard tile, followed by his hands, then his body slumping sideways onto the cold, unyielding floor like a statue crumbling in slow motion. His forehead hit the floor with a dull thud, his pulse erratic, his mind screaming but lips silent, and yet the world moved around him as if he were invisible. As though Ethan Blake, the man who gave and gave, was just another forgotten body in a hallway too crowded to notice one more soul collapsing. He tried to speak, to lift his hand, but only managed a soft groan lost in the echo of rolling trolleys and barking orderlies. Minutes passed like hours, no help came. His stylish watch blinked 6:42 p.m., but time meant nothing now. In a cruel twist of irony, this hospital, this place he had kept alive with donations and faith, didn't even recognize him when he was gasping for air on its own floor. The fluorescent light above him flickered again, almost mockingly, as if the universe itself had turned its back. His heart pounded like a war drum, but no army came to his rescue. The silence inside him was louder than the chaos outside. Just as darkness began to swallow his sight completely, just as hope began to dissolve like smoke, something gentle, soft, warm, a small hand, touched his own trembling fingers. He blinked slowly, vision blurred, barely able to focus, but he felt it, a fragile yet firm grip, a human touch that carried no agenda, no recognition, no judgment. The hand didn't belong to a nurse, nor a doctor, nor someone from his golden world. It was a child's hand, delicate, cool and real. It wasn't money that brought this hand to him, it wasn't fame. It was pain meeting pain, it was humanity finding him when the world chose to ignore him. The trembling in his chest paused for a moment, not healed, but held. A tiny voice he couldn't fully hear whispered something like, "Don't be scared, mister. I'm here." And for the first time in hours, Ethan Blake, once a giant among men, now broken on a hospital floor, felt seen. Ethan's blurred vision slowly adjusted, revealing the outline of a small figure crouched beside him, fragile, gentle, glowing not in light but in intention. The little hand that gripped his was trembling but determined, and though he still couldn't lift his head, he found himself clinging to that warmth like a man drowning clutches driftwood in a storm. The girl's golden curls hung like sunlight over her small shoulders, and her sharp pink dress, faded and threadbare, looked like it had known joy once, perhaps a birthday or a memory, now worn into silence. Her blue eyes, clearer than any sky Ethan had ever seen, stared at him with a worry too heavy for such a small soul. "Mister, don't close your eyes. I'm here," she repeated softly, her voice quivering like a song sung through tears, and her tiny hand brushed his forehead with a care that felt more powerful than any medical machine could offer. From her little schoolbag, frayed at the edges and patched with mismatched buttons, she pulled a small white cloth, clean despite its age, and began gently dabbing the sweat off his skin, her fingers careful, like Xiao's sewing. He'd done this before, maybe for her mother, who now lay fighting for her life behind emergency doors. Ethan, though still unable to speak clearly, felt a surge of emotion swell inside him, not because of pain, but because someone, this child, had stopped in a world that was otherwise moving fast and cold. His chest still ached, but her presence dulled the chaos, gave it shape, and turned his suffering into something that could be held, understood, even shared. She wasn't frightened by his suit or his age or his condition. In fact, she didn't seem to care who he was, only that he needed her. And in that, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years. Worth that wasn't tied to wealth, power, or status. The corridor around them buzzed with urgency, beeping machines, clattering stretchers, voices on radios, but this moment between him and the girl existed in a quiet bubble untouched by the outside. Her hands, though small, were steady. Her expression carried more courage than the grown adults rushing past them. She wasn't just holding his hand, she was anchoring him back to life. Every breath he drew felt easier with her near, as though her presence rewrote the rules of pain. Her knees pressed the cold floor, but she didn't flinch, didn't move, didn't blink away the tear forming in the corner of her eye. When Ethan's lips parted slightly, he tried to speak, but only a hoarse sound escaped, and the girl leaned in. "It's okay. You don't have to talk. I'm here until you're better," she whispered again, her words wrapping around him like a blanket in a snowstorm. In a strange, almost surreal way, Ethan wondered if she was real, an angel sent during his collapse, or maybe a ghost of someone from the innocence he'd lost long ago. But she was real, her tiny fingernails painted with chipped glitter polish, the small band-aid on her elbow, the untied string in her hair, and she was here. Her body language radiated resilience. She didn't cry, she didn't scream, she simply stayed. She kept brushing his forehead, adjusting his tie slightly so he could breathe easier, checking if he could squeeze her fingers. For a moment, Ethan saw flashes of his younger self, lost in a foster system, longing for someone to hold his hand like this. And now, here she was, a stranger child with a heart stronger than steel, giving him what even billionaires could not buy, human comfort. She looked toward the emergency doors, worry flickering across her features, and muttered, "Mommy's inside. They said she's very sick," then turned back to Ethan and added, "But I think you're really sick too. Don't worry, I can help both of you." Those words pierced something deep inside Ethan, deeper than the panic or the pressure or the business world's cruelty. No one had ever said they would take care of him, not since his childhood, not even as an adult. Everyone depended on him, employees, foundations, even politicians, but no one had ever looked at him like he was fragile and worthy of care. This girl who had nothing, offered him everything. He watched her wipe his brow again, then gently adjust his arm to a more comfortable angle, murmuring, "That's better, right?" And it was. It truly was. His breathing steadied, his pulse slowed, the cold sweat began to dry. Her kindness didn't just treat his body, it rewrote the language of his pain. And then, for the first time in hours, a nurse finally noticed them, hurried over, and exclaimed, "Oh my God, that's..." But Lily stood and quickly replied, He needs help. I stayed with him so he wouldn't be scared. Ethan tried to protest, to explain, but his throat remained dry. The nurse called for a stretcher. As staff finally surrounded him, Lily reached out and touched his cheek gently, whispering, "Don't forget me, okay? I think you need a friend." Her voice echoed in his head like a prayer. As he was lifted onto a stretcher, eyes barely open, he tried to hold on to that feeling, that fragile, radiant presence that had pulled him from the shadows. And just before the hallway lights faded behind him, he caught one last glimpse of her, the little girl with the faded pink dress and barefoot bravery, standing alone, waving softly, unaware she had just saved the life of a man the world thought couldn't be broken. As Ethan disappeared behind closing emergency room doors, the last image burned into his memory was that little barefoot girl standing in a pool of flickering hospital light, her hand slowly slipping from his as the staff finally took notice of what she had already seen, his silent suffering. The medical team rushed, machines beeped, voices rose, but inside him, everything stayed quiet, echoing only with her tiny voice and the warmth she left behind. He lost consciousness soon after, but in the chaos of IV lines and cardiac monitors, his mind clung to her presence like a thread stitched into the fabric of his soul. Meanwhile, Lily stood alone outside the ward, her backpack hugged tightly against her chest, head resting gently atop it, her knees pulled into her chest. The hospital floor beneath her was hard, cold, and stained, but she didn't complain. She didn't ask for a blanket, or food, or even attention. She had been invisible in places like this many times before, but tonight felt different. Her eyes never left the door. She didn't know who he was. She just wanted to make sure the man she held didn't disappear like so many others in her life had. Hours passed. The fluorescent lights above began to hum and patients shuffled past, but Lily didn't move. A janitor offered her candy and a nurse told her to sleep on a bench, but she simply shook her head and whispered, "I'm waiting for someone." Inside the ward, Ethan stirred awake to the scent of antiseptic and the soft beeping of his heart monitor. Tubes were attached to his nose and a faint ache pulsed through his ribs. Confused, his lips cracked open with one fragile question: "Where is the little girl?" The nurse adjusting his IV looked puzzled. "What little girl?" she asked. He sat up suddenly, ignoring the pain in his chest. "The girl, the one who was with me when I collapsed. She held my hand." His voice trembled with urgency and disbelief. "She saved me." The nurse blinked, unsure, then said she hadn't seen any child near him when he was brought in. Panic flashed in Ethan's eyes, not because he was afraid she was gone, but because he needed to know she was real. With shaking fingers, he pulled off the oxygen tube and forced himself to the edge of the bed. The staff protested, but he waved them off, determined to find her. Every movement felt like dragging a boulder across his chest, but still he rose, still he walked. Through the hallway he went, slippers scraping against the tile, gown billowing behind him like a fallen king's robe, his heart searching more than his eyes. He scanned every corner, every waiting chair, every wall, and then, near the hallway's end, in a quiet patch of dim light where the vending machines buzzed softly, he found her. Lily, sitting cross-legged on the floor, head tilted to the side, dozing lightly with her arms wrapped around her old backpack, as if it were a pillow. A single string of hair had fallen over her cheek, and her tiny feet were tucked beneath her faded pink dress. Ethan froze. Something in his soul shifted. He didn't move closer at first, he just looked, overwhelmed by the image of pure loyalty sitting on a cracked hospital floor. She had waited. In a world that hadn't waited for him, hadn't cared when he fell, this girl, who had nothing, waited without asking why. Slowly, he lowered himself onto a chair across from her, knees aching, breath shallow, eyes fixed on her sleeping face. He reached into his hospital gown pocket and pulled out a single wrapped mint from the bedside tray, quietly placing it beside her hand. She stirred at the sound, lifting her head gently. Their eyes met, his, still wet with exhaustion, hers, wide and honest. No words were spoken, they just looked. The kind of look strangers give when they've shared something deeper than language, a sacred moment wrapped in silence. Ethan gave her a small, trembling smile. Lily didn't smile back immediately, but her eyes softened. She pointed at his hospital band. "You look better now," she said softly, then added, "You found me." Ethan nodded. "I had to." Their voices didn't echo. They whispered like old friends who already understood more than needed to be said. For a man used to boardrooms and banquet halls, this exchange meant more than every award he'd ever accepted. He wanted to ask about her shoes, about her mother, about why such a tiny person carried so much strength, but he didn't, not yet. It was enough to sit there, in the hush of a dim hospital hallway, where the clocks ticked and the vending machines hummed, and two souls who had nothing in common but shared pain learned they were no longer alone. In that stillness, something invisible stitched between them, a bond born not from blood, nor favor, nor need, but from presence. From the moment she stayed, and the moment he returned. A stranger girl who gave without asking, a forgotten man who felt remembered. And in that quiet space, with no shoes and no suit, they both found something priceless, a connection neither one of them saw coming. Ethan slowly sat beside the little girl on the cold hospital bench, his breath still shallow but steadier now. And when he offered her something from the cafeteria, she glanced at him with a shy smile and said softly, "Only if you eat too," as if feeding someone else mattered more than feeding herself. And in that quiet exchange, a bond deeper than blood was born, two souls bruised by life yet tethered together by an invisible thread of compassion neither could name, and as they shared stale crackers and a few slices of aging apple, the fluorescent hospital light flickering above them, it felt more like a feast than a meal, because kindness was the true food between them. Lily, small and noble, her torn pink dress dusted with hospital floor grime, sat with her legs swinging, speaking gently about her mother, Sophia, her voice floating like a soft lullaby in the sterile air. "She used to sing to me every night. Her voice made the bad dreams go away," she said, eyes distant, as though remembering music that now lived only in memory, and Ethan, listening with his whole heart, realized he had never truly heard such bravery, because this girl spoke not in anger or bitterness, but with hope gently stitched into every word, even when she said, "Now she can't even whisper, the machines do the breathing for her." And Ethan turned his gaze from her to the hallway where her mother lay beyond closed ICU doors, wondering how a child so small carried a grief so vast, and then she continued, "My daddy, he went to heaven when I was just a baby. I don't remember him, but Mommy always says he was kind like you," and that sentence hit Ethan like a silent scream, "kind like you," as if the universe had gently whispered it through her lips just to remind him who he used to be before boardrooms and broken promises hollowed him out. And for a moment he couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, because this girl had just unknowingly handed him a mirror, showing him that he was still capable of being the man he once admired in others. She reached into her faded backpack, pulled out a wrinkled photo of her mother holding her as a baby, and held it up like it was the crown jewel of her world. "That's her," she whispered. "She looks different now, but that's her smile." And Ethan studied the photo, a young woman radiant with motherly joy, the kind of woman who poured everything into her child, and somehow, despite the world's cruelty, still sang lullabies to chase away shadows, and something deep inside Ethan shifted. A place he didn't know had gone cold began to warm, not with pity, but with awe, because this child wasn't asking for help, she was offering it. Just by being present, by listening to his silence and giving him company when the world had looked through him. As night crept in and visiting hours faded, nurses dimmed the lights and walked past without glancing, but Ethan remained, as Lily slowly curled up beside him on the bench, pulling her backpack under her head and whispering, "They said Mommy didn't wake up today. They said it's bad," her voice shaking now, the strength in her beginning to tremble, and Ethan, without a word, reached out and held her tiny hand in both of his, cradling it like it was glass, like it was the most sacred thing he'd ever touched. And when her tears finally fell, silent and without drama, soaking into her pink dress, Ethan didn't speak, didn't try to fix it with empty words. He simply stayed, holding her as if her sadness was his own, as if by just being there he could shield her from the storm she was too small to understand. For minutes, then hours, they stayed like that. A billionaire who had saved lives with money but was now saving his soul with silence, and a little girl who had no idea she was healing a broken man just by existing, just by caring. Nurses passed occasionally, some glancing, none interrupting, and Ethan never once let go of her hand, even when she drifted to sleep with her head against his arm, even when his own body begged for rest, because he knew this moment, this quiet, powerful moment, was more meaningful than any charity gala or award he'd ever received. She had become his reason, his anchor, his reminder that humanity wasn't in gestures of grandeur, but in the simplest acts of presence. And that night, as her tiny fingers clenched his tighter in sleep, and her breathing calmed next to his, Ethan looked toward the ICU room and whispered under his breath, "Hold on, Sophia. Your little girl's heart saved me tonight. Now I promise, I'll fight to save you." Ethan didn't let go. And neither did she, their fingers still locked as dawn crept in through the dusty hospital windows, casting a soft orange hue over the sterile white walls, as if the universe itself paused to witness a broken man and a broken child hold each other like glue to their shattering worlds. The buzz of the hospital grew louder with morning rounds, but Ethan stayed still, watching the fragile girl beside him draw invisible lines on the cold metal bench with her fingertip, her head occasionally glancing at the ICU door. Meanwhile, across the city, boardrooms panicked, headlines questioned the disappearance of the philanthropic billionaire, and shareholders grew restless. But Ethan, for the first time in years, wasn't thinking about profits or stocks. He was thinking about how Lily smiled even when her heart was bleeding. His phone vibrated non-stop, but he ignored it, until one call came through, a persistent assistant who finally tracked his location. The door creaked, and in came a sharply dressed man who froze at the sight before him, his world-famous boss sitting cross-legged in worn-out clothes, a child leaning against his shoulder, both sketching little houses and stick figures on scrap paper. "Sir, what are you doing here?" The assistant gasped in disbelief, blinking as if seeing a ghost. Ethan didn't flinch. Without turning his gaze away from the crayon drawing, he replied calmly, "Healing." No further explanation, no boardroom jargon, just one word that said everything. The assistant opened his mouth again, but saw the look in Ethan's eyes, clearer than ever, peaceful like never before, and silently stepped out. Ethan stood and walked to the billing counter, giving instructions to settle every expense under a fake name. He didn't want anyone to know. He didn't need applause. Later that day, he brought Lily a pink hair clip and a box of watercolors, and she beamed like he'd given her a treasure chest. "For my next masterpiece," she giggled, her voice the sweetest sound in that cold corridor. As night fell again, Ethan returned to Sophia's bedside, reading stories aloud while Lily curled into the crook of his arm. One night, when the machines beeped more slowly than usual, Lily asked, "Do you think Mommy hears me?" Ethan paused, looked at her trembling lip and whispered, "I think she hears your heart louder than your words." That was the first time Lily smiled and cried at the same time. In those quiet nights, between shared apple slices and whispered bedtime stories, Ethan began telling her tales, not of boardrooms or business deals, but of stars that never stopped shining, even when the world forgot to look up. He watched her sketch a picture of three people holding hands under a sun with a smiley face, and wondered how a child with so little could carry so much love. Not once did he mention who he really was. She didn't ask, and he didn't offer. It wasn't about him. It was about her, about giving without needing to be seen. He wanted to be the man who showed up, not the CEO who signed checks. When Sophia stirred slightly one evening, Lily leapt up with joy, and Ethan gently calmed her down, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Let's give her strength by being patient," he whispered. They sat in silence, praying in their own ways. That night, Lily gave him one of her worn-out storybooks and said, "In case you ever get scared again." He held it like it was made of gold. Every corner of that hospital, every crack in the tiles, every fluorescent light flicker began holding memories for Ethan. Memories not of suffering, but of something sacred being rebuilt from ruins. While the world still searched for him, Ethan stayed rooted in this little girl's orbit, learning that love wasn't about grandeur, it was about crayons, warm glances, and sitting beside someone through the silence. No headlines captured that. No cameras were there. Just a man, stripped of titles, discovering the only identity that ever truly mattered, the one you earn through kindness, not status. And then, as if fate had been holding its breath too long, it exhaled with fury. Sophia's oxygen levels dropped sharply just before dawn, machines beeped in panic, and nurses swarmed her bed while Lily, startled from sleep, clutched Ethan's hand tighter than ever before, her tiny fingers trembling with silent terror. The calm they'd built in whispers and soft sketches began to unravel as doctors murmured about the facility's overcrowding and financial prioritization, suggesting a transfer that would mean fewer machines, less staff, and dimmer hope. Ethan stood up like a storm breaking loose from years of silence, his commanding voice thundering through the hall as he faced the board in his rumpled shirt, eyes blazing with fury and pain. "She's not being moved, not on my watch." A voice too fierce, too certain to come from any ordinary man. Nurses paused mid-step, patients turned heads, and one young intern whispered the words that cracked the silence like glass. "Wait, is that Ethan Blake?" The hospital director squinted, then stumbled back in recognition, heart sinking under the weight of realization as the world outside caught scent of the headline. Within minutes, the quiet hall was flooded by flashing lights and desperate questions, reporters elbowing their way through orderlies, calling his name like he was royalty fallen from the sky, and Lily, holding her half-eaten apple slice and confused heart, blinked rapidly, not understanding why men with cameras were yelling. A reporter shouted, "Is it true you've been here for 3 days? Why this woman? Why this child?" And another screamed, "Why would a billionaire sketch with a homeless girl?" And as the chaos spun around them, Lily stood frozen until her voice cracked. You're the Ethan Blake?" Her words weren't angry or betrayed, just small, broken, echoing through a place where trust had been growing like fragile roots in the dark. Ethan slowly knelt, the camera flashes catching the lines on his tired face, and said gently, "Yes, that's me. But I'm still the man who wiped your tears with my sleeve, still the man who sat with you when you were scared, still the one who made paper boats out of hospital brochures because we had nothing else to play with. I'm still him, Lily." She stared at him for a moment, the weight of his truth crashing into her world of crayons and crackers, then reached out and touched his hair like she was making sure he was real. Upstairs, Sophia stirred faintly in her bed, eyes fluttering open to the sound of her daughter's voice drifting through the corridor, only to glance at the TV on the corner wall. And there he was, the kind-eyed man who brought warm soup and hope every night, now framed in headlines. Ethan Blake, billionaire hiding in plain sight. Her heart skipped as her fogged memory clicked into place. She had seen him before, years ago, in an old newspaper during a charity gala her husband once admired. The truth hit her like a tidal wave. The man who tucked her daughter in, who whispered stories when her lungs could no longer sing, who cried beside her while pretending he wasn't, was the Ethan Blake, founder of half the tech world, a name synonymous with unreachable power. Back downstairs, Ethan tried shielding Lily from the noise, wrapping his arm around her as more security guards swarmed the ward, but the press had already scented the human story of the year. Billionaire saved by poor girl, a love beyond class? And in that chaos, something unexpected happened. Lily, instead of stepping away, leaned into him and whispered, "I don't care if you're rich, I just don't want you to leave us now." Ethan felt something cold lapse inside him, a wall he hadn't realized was still standing. He looked into her teary blue eyes, saw Sophia's reflection in them, and gently nodded. "I'm not going anywhere, I promise." The hospital administration, now both frightened and thrilled, offered VIP care instantly, upgraded Sophia's room without blinking, and called in their best pulmonologist, all while pretending it wasn't because of who he was. But Ethan didn't care for the show. He only cared that Sophia could breathe easier and that Lily could finally sleep without shivering on a hospital bench. That evening, Sophia, more awake now but still frail, asked with cracked lips, "Why? Why would someone like you stay?" Ethan stepped forward slowly, his voice quieter than she expected. "Because someone like you once made me feel seen when I was invisible, and your daughter reminded me I still have a heart." A long silence followed, full of unshed tears and unspoken understandings, and for the first time since her illness began, Sophia smiled. Weakly, yes, but real. The storm hadn't passed yet, but the truth had been set free, and in its wake, something unshakable began to grow, not built on money or mystery, but on humanity, kindness, and the quiet miracle of being found when you thought the world had forgotten you. Sophia blinked in disbelief at the television, her lips trembling as reality crashed over her like a tidal wave. This kind, quiet man who sat through the lonely hours with her daughter, who brought apple slices and gentle stories, was not some wandering soul with a bruised past but Ethan Blake, the billionaire CEO, whose name was whispered in boardrooms and screamed across headlines. Panic swelled in her chest, overwhelming the gratitude she had once felt, morphing into fear, suspicion, and the cruel weight of humiliation as she whispered with a voice both frail and sharp, "Why would a man like you help someone like us?" Her words hung heavy in the sterile hospital air, thicker than any IV drip or heartbeat monitor, and Ethan, standing at the foot of her bed, didn't flinch, his blue eyes softened as they shimmered, not with pride or defense, but with the sorrow of a man who had tasted both loneliness and judgment, and now stood misunderstood once again, and he quietly replied, "Because your daughter held my hand when no one else did, and you raised a hero." But Sophia, wrapped in her paper gown and tangled in tubes, pulled the thin bedsheet closer to her chest like armor, retreating into a fortress of old wounds, whispering how she'd known men who helped just to be praised, or helped only to later hold it against her, or worse, become stories for the world to mock. And she didn't want Lily to be anyone's sympathy story, especially not on the front page. Her fingers trembled, her voice broke as she pleaded, "Please, if you ever cared, don't turn us into a headline." And with that, she begged him, quietly, painfully, tearfully, to walk away once she was discharged, to forget the nights of silent prayers and shared stories, to forget the little girl with messy braids who'd held on to him as if the world depended on it. Ethan felt the words crush something inside him, but he didn't argue, didn't fight, didn't explain how he wasn't helping for show, but because for the first time in years, he felt. And it was Lily and Sophia who taught him that wealth could buy hospitals but not healing, offices but not warmth. He simply nodded with a pain buried deep beneath his silence, turned without another word, and walked out of the room, his heartbeat heavier than his footsteps, leaving behind only the echo of his kindness and a small white envelope placed gently on the table beside her water cup, its flap trembling in the draft from the open door. Inside was no check, no press release, no dramatic gesture, just a folded note written in his own hurried scrawl, which Sophia would find hours later when the sun began to set and the halls turned quiet again. Her hands, Diaz would shake as she opened it, eyes already stinging with regret, and she would read the words. Simple and honest, the kind that pierced through fear like morning light through curtains. "I won't stop helping, even if you don't see me. I'll be there." And as her tears dripped onto the paper, blurring the ink into gentle waves, she would clutch the note to her chest, torn between pride and need, between fear and hope, realizing that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a story about pity, but about grace, about a man in a sharp blue suit who showed up not to save them but to remind them they were worth saving all along. Weeks passed, but to Ethan, each one crawled like a lifetime without the echo of Lily's laughter, or the warmth of her tiny hand wrapped around his fingers. She was gone, and so was the fragile bond that had healed the deepest cracks in his soul. Sophia had returned home with Lily, proud but hesitant, her quiet strength resisting dependence yet secretly aching with gratitude for the unseen guardian who never missed a single detail. Hospital bills vanished from her doorstep. Grocery bags filled with the same cereal Lily loved magically appeared, and perfectly sized shoes for her growing feet always arrived just before she outgrew the last pair. Each package came signed only by a friend. But Sophia knew who the ghost benefactor was, even if she never spoke his name aloud, even if her heart trembled each time Lily whispered, "Do you think he still remembers us, Mommy?" Yet no matter how closely she watched the door, Ethan never knocked, never appeared in the frame again, only leaving behind traces of devotion too dignified to demand thanks. In his towering glass office, where numbers danced across monitors and employees rushed like currents in a storm, Ethan sat silently with his coffee untouched, his eyes locked on the corner of the room where the little pink card from Lily now lived, beside a wrinkled cracker wrapper and the hospital visitor badge he refused to throw away. His world kept growing, skyscrapers soared under his name, partnerships were signed with trembling hands by CEOs desperate to please him, but inside, a hollowness grew louder than applause, deeper than wealth, more haunting than any silence he'd ever known. He found himself returning to that same bench outside the pediatric wing after hours, just to feel the echo of her presence, the way she had giggled about the shape of the moon, how she had rested her sleepy head on his coat without asking, how her innocence had seen straight through his riches and into his heart. Some nights, he stood across the street from Sophia's building, dressed plainly, hiding in shadows like a forgotten guardian angel, just to glimpse them through the window. Lily dancing in mismatched socks, Sophia humming a broken lullaby, peace returning to a home that once knew only struggle. But Ethan never approached, respecting the distance Sophia asked for, even though every fiber of his being wanted to run to them and say, "I miss us too." One rainy evening, as thunder grumbled low and traffic lights flickered like fading hope, a nurse from the hospital caught up to him outside the shelter he used to visit weekly. She handed him a small white envelope and said with a soft smile, "This came for you at the front desk. We figured you'd want to see it." Ethan took it carefully, like it might crumble in his hands, and retreated to the nearest bench, heart pounding, not from business deals or quarterly losses, but from the unknown weight of something deeply human. He opened the envelope, fingers trembling as he unfolded a card decorated with hand-drawn stars and hearts. Inside, in wobbly handwriting, it read, "Dear Mr. Cracker friend, Mommy said you were sad. Come eat with us someday. I miss you. Love, Lily." His breath caught and something long buried broke free inside him, not in pain, this time, but in a tender ache of being remembered. The tears he'd been denying slid freely now, not for loss, but for hope. For the message that he was still wanted, still loved without conditions. Without titles, without the suit or the signature, just as the man who once sketched beside a little girl who saw past the billionaire and into the broken boy still healing inside. Ethan held the card to his chest like a lifeline, the ink bleeding slightly in the rain, and smiled for the first time in weeks, not because his empire was thriving, but because a child still believed he belonged at their table. Ethan stood at the doorstep of the modest apartment, the worn welcome mat beneath his polished shoes somehow grounding him more than any boardroom ever had, and though he wore his usual sharp blue tailored suit, his hands gripped a simple brown grocery bag, not carried by staff but selected by him, every item chosen with a thought of what Lily liked or what Sophia might need. When the door opened, Lily squealed with unfiltered joy, leaping into his arms as if no time had passed at all, her tiny hands gripping the lapels of his suit as if anchoring him to something real, something pure, while Sophia stood behind, stunned for a breath, cheeks blooming pink as she caught sight of him, her heart unsure whether to race or retreat. Ethan's eyes met hers, no diamonds, no declarations, just a quiet gaze that asked, "Can I stay?" And she, after a pause, nodded with the tiniest smile, one that cracked the ice still lodged between fear and forgiveness. Inside, their home was small, worn, but radiating a warmth money could never buy, and as they all gathered around the creaky table with mismatched chairs and chipped plates, Ethan unpacked fresh vegetables, a block of cheese, a jar of jam, a pack of spaghetti, and chocolate chip cookies. "For dessert," he said with a wink, and Lily clapped like it was Christmas. Laughter poured from the kitchen as he awkwardly chopped onions under Sophia's instruction, nearly crying from both the sting and the unfamiliar joy of being taught so. Mething so human, so domestic, while Lily set the table with exaggerated care, placing napkins and mismatched forks like she was decorating for royalty, humming a tune that filled the corners of the room with innocence. Dinner was simple, spaghetti with too much garlic and slightly burnt bread, but it tasted like a feast to Ethan, who hadn't truly savored a meal in years, not like this, not with stories, spilled water, and soft giggles punctuating each bite. After dishes were cleared and leftovers tucked away, they sat in the dim light of a flickering lamp, Ethan on the couch with Lily curled up beside him, showing him her favorite book with pages falling out, and Sophia across from them, watching with arms crossed but eyes softening with every moment, the silence between them no longer sharp but healing. Lily suddenly tugged his sleeve and whispered, "You can come back whenever you're lonely." And he blinked fast, pretending not to be moved, nodding as if it were a casual invitation, but it echoed through his ribcage like a song he never knew he needed. Later that night, after Ethan left and the door clicked shut behind him, Lily tiptoed to her mother's bed, crawled under the blanket and whispered, "He makes the house warm." And Sophia, heart tight and eyes misty, pulled her daughter close, realizing that Ethan hadn't just stepped into their home. He'd stepped into their hearts, piece by fragile piece. Upstairs, Ethan sat in his car for a long while, engine off, staring at the apartment window where a curtain shifted and a small hand waved before disappearing into shadows, and for the first time in years, he felt the ache of not wanting to go back to his penthouse, not because it wasn't luxurious, but because it was too quiet, too cold, too hollow. That night, he didn't dream of stock markets or investor meetings, but of bedtime stories, Sophia's quiet smile as she stirred pasta, and Lily's tiny fingers clutching his coat again as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And somewhere, in the fragile stillness of that evening, 3 hearts began beating to the same rhythm, not because they planned to, but because sometimes, family finds you not in blood, but in moments shared over burnt bread and laughter in small rooms. And as Ethan tucked Lily into bed that night, her tiny hand gripping his finger just before drifting into sleep, something stirred inside him that no boardroom victory or corporate merger had ever brought. It was peace, full and deep. So on the following quiet Sunday morning, when the world seemed to slow down just enough to hear hearts instead of horns, he led Sophia and Lily to a sun-dappled garden behind the hospital, a place blooming with hope and the scent of jasmine that danced gently in the breeze. The wooden bench stood there, still weathered, still familiar. The very place where a scared little girl once offered him a cracker and unknowingly shattered every wall he had ever built. Ethan looked at Lily, who now held a basket of daisies, her blue eyes sparkling with innocent mischief, and then he turned to Sophia, who wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a soft smile and the strength of 1,000 storms survived. Slowly, he bent down on one knee, not out of tradition, but from a soul that longed to stay grounded in the only truth he now believed in. Love, not wealth, builds legacies. In his hand, not a velvet box, but a delicate ring woven with simplicity and purpose. It wasn't the price, but the promise it carried that mattered. Sophia's breath hitched. Her fingers trembled slightly as he took her hand gently. "You saved me through her," he whispered, voice cracking with gratitude he could no longer contain. "Will you give me the honor to be her father, and your husband?" His eyes held no corporate armor, no executive pride, only a man stripped bare, offering his whole self not to impress, but to belong. Lily, already bouncing in place, squealed, "Say yes, Mom. Please," and her tiny arms wrapped around both of them in a hug that spoke louder than vows. Tears fell freely down Sophia's cheeks, but this time they weren't from fear, but from the healing that comes when broken pieces finally find where they belong. She nodded slowly, unable to speak, but her eyes answered with a certainty carved from every night she had fought alone and every moment she had secretly hoped someone would stay. Ethan kissed her hand, then leaned forward to kiss Lily's forehead. The garden, once quiet, now echoed with laughter, not loud but full, as if the earth itself celebrated the family it had witnessed forming from pain, resilience and blind faith. They sat on the bench afterward, Ethan in the middle, Lily nestled on one side, Sophia leaning gently on the other, no longer afraid of headlines, no longer defined by struggle, but woven together by a story no tabloid could ever truly capture. Sophia looked at Ethan and whispered, "She was always looking for her father. Maybe I was too." And he closed his eyes, letting that truth rest inside his chest like a sacred flame. The wind picked up slightly, brushing against their faces, carrying with it the memories of every cold night, every hospital whisper, every quiet meal shared without knowing it would lead here. And as the sun dipped lower, casting a golden hue over the garden, Lily pointed to the clouds and said, "Look, Mommy, it's like heaven's smiling." Sophia squeezed Ethan's hand, and he squeezed back, promising silently that this life, this love, this second chance, would never be taken for granted. And so the girl who once fell asleep clutching a stranger's coat unknowingly built a bridge from loneliness to family, from fear to forever, from a bench in a hallway to a life where hearts finally had a home. Because in the end, it wasn't the power, the suits, or the empire that changed Ethan Blake. It was the small, sticky hand of a child who believed he was good before he did, and sometimes, the smallest hands really do hold the biggest hearts, and heal the deepest wounds.